The neon sign didn't flicker. It burned with a cold, merciless glow that seemed to swallow the desert night whole. A tower of black glass and steel rising from the Las Vegas Strip like a throne built for the devil himself. The sign read the Obsidian, but everyone who knew anything called it the Cage. Everyone knew the rules here. Don't look the men in black suits in the eye. Don't ask names. And never ever say no to the owner. When the bartender position opened up, 5 people applied. 4 quit in absolute terror halfway through the interview. The 5th was Gemma. She was 26 years old, orphaned at 12, survived 2 abusive foster homes, carried $62 in her bank account, $80,000 in debt left by a husband who vanished into the night, and a younger brother in rehab she'd sell her soul to save. She didn't take the job because she was brave. She took it because the wolves chasing her on the outside were hungrier than the wolf waiting inside. She didn't know it yet, but walking through those heavy glass doors was about to change everything. It would either save her life or end it. And somewhere on the top floor, a man named Jasper Drake, the king of Las Vegas's underworld, was about to meet the one woman who wouldn't bow. If you're hooked and want to see how this unfolds, smash that like button. Share this with someone who loves a good dark romance, and subscribe so you don't miss what happens next. Now let's go back to the moment Gemma Lane stepped into the Devil's Den. Gemma's 2009 Honda Civic groaned as she turned into the rear parking lot behind the Obsidian, where Bentleys and Rolls-Royces lined up like sleeping predatory beasts. She shut off the engine and sat still for a moment, looking into the rearview mirror and meeting her own eyes. Dark circles, exhaustion, but not a hint of weakness. She stepped out, the click of her cheap heels tapping against cold concrete as she headed for the staff entrance, a heavy steel door with no sign, as if it didn't want anyone to find it. She knocked 3 times and waited. The door opened, a draft of air cold as a tomb's breath washing over her face, and there in front of her stood a man time seemed to have carved into with a knife. Every line on his face etched hard. Bruno Castellan, white hair slicked straight back, a face full of scars like a map of a life steeped in violence, studied her from head to toe with steel-cold gray eyes. He didn't greet her. He didn't smile. He only asked, his voice roughened by cigarette smoke, did she know what kind of place this was? Gemma didn't blink. She answered that she did, and that she didn't talk to cops. Bruno watched her for 3 more seconds, then stepped aside and let her in. They moved through a long corridor with black velvet walls, crystal chandeliers glittering overhead like stars in hell, until Bruno stopped at a private elevator door. He swiped a card, the doors parted, and they stepped inside. The elevator carried them deeper, not up but down, into the earth, into a place sunlight had never touched. When the doors opened, Gemma had to hold her breath for a second. The Obsidian's VIP basement didn't resemble anywhere she'd ever seen. A long bar of black marble ran the length of one wall, bottles arranged like gemstones catching the soft gold light, black leather chairs, dark oak tables, and 20 men scattered around the room. They wore expensive suits, watches whose price could have fed Gemma for a whole year, and each of them gave off a quiet kind of power that made the air feel heavier. When she entered behind Bruno, the conversations faded into silence. 20 pairs of eyes fixed on her, not with curiosity, but with the gaze of predators measuring prey. Gemma kept her back straight, her eyes forward, and walked toward the bar as if she belonged there. Bruno pointed to the spot behind it and said curtly, "Stand there and don't do anything stupid." She had just set her hand on the bar's icy stone when a voice rose from the corner of the room, high and sharp like a madman's laughter. "Oh, look what Bruno dragged in, a little lost bunny." Gemma turned her head. The man approaching had a shaved skull, a long scar cutting through his left eyebrow, and eyes that danced with the unstable energy of a bomb about to go off. Phoenix Carver. She remembered hearing someone whisper that name as she passed through the hallway. He leaned against the bar, his gaze sliding over her with the amused interest of a cat watching a mouse. "Hey, Bunny," he said. "Pour me a whiskey, and let's see if your hands shake." Gemma looked at him for 3 seconds, then turned to the shelves, took down a bottle of 30-year Macallan, poured a neat glass with precise movements and not the slightest tremor, and pushed it toward him. $400, she said, as calmly as if she were naming the price of filtered water. Phoenix lifted a brow, the scar on his forehead tightening. $400 for one drink. You trying to rob me?" Gemma didn't blink. "The whiskey is $400, she said. "The attitude's free, but if you want service with a smile, that'll cost extra." The room went dead silent. Gemma could feel every stare stabbing into her back like knives, and for a heartbeat she wondered if she'd just signed her own death notice. Then Phoenix laughed, loud and echoing across the room, his head tipping back, his body shaking with delight. "I like this girl," he said, turning to Bruno. "She's got guts, Bruno. More guts than all the men in this room put together." Bruno said nothing, but the corner of his mouth lifted, a gesture so small it was almost invisible, and he gave a single nod. "All right," he told Gemma. "You're on a trial shift tonight. Do well, and you come back. Do badly, and don't ever let me see your face again." Gemma nodded, and when she turned back to the bright bottles lined up in front of her, she let herself breathe out softly. She didn't know she'd just passed the first test of countless tests still to come, and she knew even less that somewhere on the top floor of this building, a man was watching her through the security camera feed, and for the first time in years, he felt curious about a woman. Gemma had just set the Macallan back onto the shelf when the sound rang out, the chime of the private elevator in the corner of the room, a clear, delicate note that somehow carried the weight of a death sentence. She sensed the shift before she saw anything. The air in the room suddenly congealed, as if someone had sucked all the oxygen away. Conversations died right on people's lips, and Phoenix, who'd been laughing out loud a minute ago, went silent as if someone had flipped a switch. The elevator doors slid open and a man stepped out. For the first second, Gemma didn't even know what she was looking at, because this man didn't enter the room. He took possession of it. 6'1", broad-shouldered, hair black as ink with a few silver strands at his temples, and eyes the color of deep whiskey, the kind aged in oak barrels for 30 years, dark and dangerous. A scar ran from the left corner of his mouth down to his chin, not making him uglier, but turning him into something like a sculpture of violence carved to perfection. The black suit he wore was tailored down to every stitch, hugging his body like a second skin, and the Patek Philippe on his wrist caught the light each time he moved. Jasper Drake, she heard someone whisper, or maybe she whispered it herself, or maybe the name simply rose into the air like a curse. He crossed the room and everyone moved aside the way water parts before a ship's bow. Even Bruno, the man Gemma had thought was the most frightening person in this place, dipped his head slightly as Jasper passed. Jasper stopped in front of Bruno and asked, his voice low as distant thunder. "Who is she?" Bruno answered without hesitation. "The new bartender. If she survives tonight." Jasper didn't react to that. He only turned his head, and for the first time those dark whiskey eyes settled on Gemma. She felt the stare like physical weight pressing against her chest, as if he were looking straight through her skin, through her cheap old clothes, through every wall she'd built around herself for 26 years. Jasper walked to the bar, unhurried, each step firm and deliberate, and stopped across from her with only the cold black marble between them. "Macallan," he said. "Neat." Gemma turned back to the shelves and told herself her hands wouldn't shake. They couldn't shake. They didn't have the right to shake. She took the bottle down, poured a glass with the same steady motion she'd done 1,000 times, and slid it toward him. Jasper lifted the glass, brought it to his lips, took a small sip, never taking his eyes off her the entire time. Then he set it down and asked, as calmly as if he were asking about the weather, "Are you afraid of me?" Gemma held his gaze, and she didn't know where this courage came from. Maybe from those starving nights in foster care. Maybe from the time she'd been beaten and still gotten back up. Maybe from the $62 in her account and the $80,000 of debt hanging over her head. But she answered without the slightest tremor in her voice. "I used to be afraid of a lot of things, but now I'm only afraid of not having money to pay my rent." The room was so silent Gemma could hear her own heart. 1 beat, 2 beats, 3 beats. Jasper looked at her, and for a brief moment, she saw something flicker in those whiskey dark eyes. Not anger, not contempt, but something she couldn't read. Then he placed a $100 bill on the bar without another word, turned his back, and walked away. The elevator doors closed behind him, and the room seemed to wake from a trance. Phoenix let out a long whistle, stepped up beside Gemma, and said with a mix of admiration and disbelief, "You just talked to Jasper Drake like he was a normal customer. Do you know who he is? He owns this city. He's the king, and you just looked the king in the eyes without bowing your head." Gemma picked up the $100 bill, folded it, and slipped it into her pocket. She didn't answer Phoenix, because she was too busy trying to keep her knees from buckling. She'd just passed the most dangerous test of her life, and she didn't know whether that made her safer, or only pushed her deeper into the wolf's mouth. After Jasper Drake disappeared into the elevator, the room slowly returned to its usual rhythm. But Gemma knew there was nothing usual about this place. She worked through the next hours like a perfectly programmed machine, pouring drinks, polishing glasses, memorizing everything. As she polished the glasses, she subconsciously flicked open her silver Zippo lighter, a small habit she'd kept for years to calm her nerves during long shifts. She learned faster than she'd thought she could. The man in the gray suit in the left corner drank Hennessy XO, and was never to be looked in the eye because he was a federal judge. The guy with the snake tattoo on his neck only drank Beluga vodka, and could be spoken to if he spoke first. The three men at the round table near the door weren't to be served directly but only through Phoenix because they were from a Chicago Mafia family in the middle of negotiations. Every face was a piece of the puzzle, every drink a lesson, and Gemma swallowed it all into her memory, as if her life depended on it, because it did. Around midnight, she noticed the presence of a man she hadn't seen before. He was 6'7", shoulders as wide as a doorway, dark-skinned, head shaved to a glossy sheen, and eyes cold as dead fish. He stood in the corner like a statue, not talking, not drinking, only watching everything with the stare of someone who'd seen death too many times for it to be anything but boring. Phoenix leaned over the bar and whispered into Gemma's ear that was Orion Vance, former Navy SEAL, now Jasper's right hand for security, and if she ever saw him move toward someone, she should pray that person wasn't her. Gemma nodded and kept working. But she kept Orion in her sight the way you kept a tiger in a room. Around 1 a.m, the incident happened. A young man, maybe just past 30, wearing an expensive suit but soaked in sweat, was caught cheating at the poker table in the room next door. Gemma didn't see what happened. She only heard a strangled scream, and then she saw Orion Vance dragging the man across the room like a rag doll, his massive hand clamped around the back of the victim's neck like he was grabbing a kitten. They vanished through a door at the end of the hallway, and a few minutes later the screams came through, choked, painful, desperate, then cut off abruptly as if someone had switched off a radio. The room kept running as if nothing had happened. The men kept drinking, kept talking, kept laughing. Gemma felt her stomach tighten, but she didn't let it show on her face. She kept pouring, her hands steady, her eyes calm. Bruno watched her from the corner of the room, and when their eyes met, he gave a nod so small it was almost invisible, a sign of acceptance. By 3 a.m, the room began to thin out. The men left in groups, dissolving into the Las Vegas night like ghosts. Gemma cleaned the bar, wiped every spilled drop, put every bottle back in the exact order she'd been taught. When she'd just set the rag down, Bruno appeared beside her without a sound, as if he were made of smoke. He handed her a thick envelope and said nothing. Gemma took it, felt its weight, and instinctively wanted to ask why it was so much. But she remembered the rule. Don't ask. Never ask. She only nodded and slid the envelope into her jacket pocket. Bruno spoke in that smoke-rough voice. Come back tomorrow night. On time. Then he turned and vanished into the dark. Gemma went out the back door into the parking lot, now almost empty. Her Honda Civic sat alone under a flickering streetlight, small and pathetic against the desert darkness. She climbed into the driver's seat, locked the doors, and only then opened the envelope. Inside were $2,000 in cash, all hundreds, crisp, as if they'd just been printed. She counted it twice to be sure, then sat there in the dark, staring at the money in her hands. $2,000 for one night of work. Enough to pay for Noah's rehab for a month. Enough to buy more time before the debt collectors caught up with her. Gemma drove through Las Vegas at dawn, neon lights blurring beyond the glass like broken dreams. She reached her shabby studio apartment downtown, where the paint peeled from the walls, where the neighbors sold drugs right out in the hallway, where she'd lived for the past 6 months like a rat in a hole. She sat on the edge of the bed, looking at the envelope of money in her hand, and for the first time in months, she felt something like hope. But she wasn't naive. She knew she'd just signed a contract with the devil. She knew this money didn't come free. She knew what she'd witnessed tonight, the choked screams, the sudden silence, was only the tip of the iceberg. But the devil paid well, and she had a little brother she needed to save. Gemma lay down on the bed without changing, her eyes fixed on the cracked ceiling. She'd come back tomorrow night. She'd keep pouring drinks, keep silent, keep pretending she didn't see anything. And she'd survive, no matter the cost. 2 weeks passed like a strange dream Gemma wasn't sure she wanted to wake from or sink deeper into. She learned how to survive in the underworld, the way an animal learned to camouflage in the jungle, day by day, night by night, drink by poured drink. She knew what each man liked before he even opened his mouth. She knew who was in a good mood and who was on the edge of exploding just by the angle of their shoulder. She knew when to appear and when to turn invisible. Phoenix Carver, the man who'd called her a lost little bunny on the first night, had now become her reluctant protector. One night, a newly hired low-level guy deliberately bumped into Gemma as she carried a tray of drinks, spilling everything down her shirt while he snickered with his friends. Phoenix came out of nowhere, grabbed the man by the collar, and said in a voice cold as ice, "She belongs to the bar. Touch her again and I'll show you why they call me Phoenix. Because I'll burn you to ash." From that night on, no one dared look at Gemma the wrong way again. Then Diana Sterling appeared. She was 45, black hair cut short and neat, dressed like a businesswoman straight out of Forbes, but her eyes were cold as a snake's. Diana was the organization's information boss. Nothing happened in this city that she didn't know. No one had a secret she couldn't dig up. The first time Diana stepped up to the bar and looked at Gemma, that gaze felt like it was dissecting her cell by cell. She didn't say a word. She only ordered a gin and tonic and sat there watching Gemma for 3 hours. The second night, Diana did the same. The third night, she abruptly asked Gemma in a chilling voice, "I heard someone asked you about Castellan's schedule. What did you say?" Gemma answered without hesitation. "I said I only know how to mix drinks. If someone wants to know anything else, they've got the wrong person." Diana held her stare for a few seconds, then gave a single nod and walked away. From that night on, Diana occasionally stopped by the bar and actually talked with Gemma, not interrogations, but brief conversations about all kinds of ordinary things, and Gemma understood she'd just passed another test. But the hardest test came from Jasper Drake. He showed up at the bar every night, sometimes early, sometimes late, but never absent, and every night he asked her to bring his drink to his private table in the corner of the room, where the shadows were thickest, where no one dared approach unless invited. Gemma would carry the glass of Macallan across the room, feeling his eyes tracking every step she took, then set the drink down and stand there waiting. Sometimes he let her stand for minutes before saying anything at all. Sometimes he asked strange questions. Which season did she like best? Did she read books? What did she think about silence? Sometimes he said nothing, only watched her with those dark, whiskey eyes as if he were trying to read every thought in her head. Those brief exchanges were taut as a string about to snap, full of meaning Gemma wasn't sure she fully understood. And every time she left his table, she felt like she'd just walked out of a storm. One night, around 1 a.m, Gemma's phone vibrated in her pocket. She asked Bruno for permission to step into the staff room to take the call, and when she saw the rehab center's number on the screen, her heart clenched. But on the other end was the head nurse's voice, cheerful and warm. "Miss Lane, I'm calling with good news. Noah's recovering very well. He's been completely clean for 2 weeks now, and his spirits are really positive. He wrote you a letter." Gemma ended the call and stood there in the tiny staff room, her back against the wall, and for the first time in months she cried. Not from misery, but from relief, from gratitude, from the simple fact that for once, something in her life was finally moving in the right direction. She didn't know Orion Vance was standing in the doorway, how long he'd been there, how much he'd seen. When she lifted her head and saw him, she went rigid, bracing for mockery or contempt. But Orion said nothing. He only looked at her for a second with eyes that were cold yet somehow not empty, then turned and walked away as if he hadn't seen anything at all. From that night on, Orion treated her differently. Not friendly. He wasn't the friendly type, but softer, as if she was no longer a potential threat, but a piece of the picture. Gemma wiped her tears, straightened her shirt, and stepped back out to continue working. But as she stood behind the bar and looked across the room, with Phoenix laughing with someone, with Diana sipping her gin and tonic and nodding at her, with Orion standing motionless like a statue in the corner, with Bruno speaking seriously to another man, she realized something that both frightened her and, strangely, made her feel steadier. She was starting to belong here. The killers, the bosses, the ghosts of the underworld were, somehow, becoming her family. And when Jasper Drake's gaze caught hers through the crowd from the corner of the room, when he lifted his glass toward her in a small gesture that was almost invisible, Gemma understood she'd fallen in too deep to turn back. That night began like every other night, but Gemma should have known that in this world, peace was only the pause before the storm. The man was a VIP guest from New York, a real estate tycoon with business ties to Jasper, and he'd been drinking too much since the moment he walked in at 10 o'clock. Gemma recognized the danger signs early, the way he stared at her for too long, the way he deliberately brushed her hand when he took his drink, the way he leaned over the bar and cracked jokes that made her want to gag. She kept her distance, kept her professional face, and hoped he'd get so drunk he'd forget she existed. But he didn't forget. Around 1 a.m, when Gemma turned her back to grab a bottle from the high shelf, he suddenly reached over the bar, grabbed her hair, and yanked hard. Gemma was jerked backward, her back slamming into the edge of the bar, pain ripping through her scalp so fast she couldn't even scream. He dragged her across the black marble, glasses shattering with a harsh clatter, and he laughed with that disgusting drunken sound. "Don't get all high and mighty with me. I know what kind you are." The room froze. Phoenix shot to his feet but didn't get the chance to move. Bruno's hand went to his gun but he didn't draw. Orion took 1 step forward, then stopped. Because Jasper Drake was there. Gemma didn't know where he came from. She hadn't heard footsteps. She hadn't seen a shadow move. He simply appeared, standing right behind the drunk man, silent as death. He didn't say a word. He didn't need to. The man must have sensed something. Maybe the cold coming off Jasper's body. Maybe the last shred of survival instinct cutting through the alcohol haze, because he abruptly let go of Gemma, as if he'd touched burning coals. He turned and saw Jasper, and all the color drained from his face. "Mr. Drake," he stammered, his voice shaking. "I was just joking. I'm sorry. I didn't know she was yours." Jasper still didn't speak. He only looked at the man with those amber, predatory eyes, and in that gaze Gemma saw something even more terrifying than anger, total indifference, as if the man in front of him wasn't worth a single word. Jasper gave a small nod toward Orion. Orion stepped in, grabbed the man by the collar, and pulled him away. Not brutal, not gentle either. And the man vanished into the hallway shadows, without daring to say another word. Gemma stood there with one hand gripping the bar to keep herself steady, her scalp still throbbing, her heart pounding like it wanted to break through her ribs. Jasper turned to look at her, and for the first time he spoke to her directly, in a voice that wasn't an order. "Come with me." She followed him into the private elevator, up to the top floor, a place she'd never set foot in before. The doors opened and Gemma stepped into Jasper Drake's office. The room was as large as an apartment, glass walls looking out over the glittering sprawl of Las Vegas below, dark interiors of walnut and black leather, a massive desk at the center, and the faint scent of sandalwood lingering in the air. Jasper pointed to the leather chair across from the desk and said, "Sit." Gemma sat, not because she was obeying, but because her legs were truly shaking. Jasper went to the liquor cabinet, but instead of pouring whiskey, he poured a glass of water and set it in front of her. "Drink," he said. "You're in shock." Gemma took the water, swallowed a sip, and tried to steady her breathing. Jasper sat down across from her, not behind the desk but in a chair directly in front of her, close enough that she could see every detail of the scar that ran from his mouth down to his chin. They sat in silence for a moment. Then Jasper spoke, his voice low and even, like rain on a tin roof. "I've investigated you, Gemma Lane." Gemma lifted her head to look at him, and before she could react, he kept going. "Orphaned at 12. Parents died in a car accident. Raised in 2 foster homes, both abusive. On your own since 18. Worked everything from dishwashing to waitressing. Married Tyler Briggs 3 years ago. He ran 6 months ago and left you $80,000 in debt. Your brother Noah Lane is currently in rehab on the outskirts of the city." Gemma felt blood rush to her face, anger flaring in her chest like fire. She shot to her feet, nearly spilling the water, and said in a voice trembling with rage, "You don't have the right. You don't have the right to invade my privacy like that." Jasper didn't move. He didn't look affected by her anger. He only watched her with calm eyes and replied, "I have the right to everything in this building, including you." Gemma clenched her teeth, turned, and walked toward the door. She'd leave. She'd never come back. She'd rather starve than be treated like an object. But just as her hand touched the doorknob, Jasper's voice came from behind her, softer than before, almost gentle. "But I won't hurt you." Gemma stopped with her hand still on the knob. "You're my employee," Jasper continued, "and that means you're protected, like what you saw tonight. No one is allowed to touch you. No one is allowed to harm you. That's the rule." Gemma turned her head back, looking at him standing near the window, his back to her, his silhouette cut against the Las Vegas night. "Why?" she asked, her voice no longer angry, only puzzled. "Why do you care?" Jasper didn't turn around. He stood there watching the city glitter below, and said nothing. Gemma waited. 1 second, 2 seconds, 10 seconds, but the answer never came. In the end, she opened the door and walked out. But on the drive home that night, she couldn't stop thinking about the lonely shadow by the window and the question he'd refused to answer. A month had passed since that night in Jasper's office, and Gemma had tried to forget the question that had never been answered, burying it deep in the dark corner of her mind along with so many other things she didn't want to face. Her life slipped into a strange rhythm of stability. Nights working at the Obsidian, days sleeping in her shabby apartment, sending money to Noah's rehab center, and trying not to think about Tyler or the $80,000 of debt hanging over her head. But then, one afternoon, when Gemma had just woken up and was making coffee with the old machine that buzzed and rattled, a knock sounded at the door. She opened it and found a small package on the floor. No sender name, only her name scrawled in blue ballpoint ink. Gemma picked it up, stepped inside, shut the door, and opened it. Inside was a black USB flash drive and a paper folded into quarters. She unfolded the paper and recognized Tyler's handwriting instantly. That sloppy, slanted script she'd seen on hundreds of hollow promises and dozens of bad checks. "Gemma, I'm sorry. Keep this safe. Don't trust anyone. I'll explain later if I'm still alive. Tyler." Gemma read it 3 times, trying to find meaning in the lines, but only finding more questions. Tyler had vanished for 6 months without a word, without a trace, leaving her with a mountain of debt and a shattered heart. And now he was sending her this. She stared at the USB in her hand, small and harmless looking. But the survival instinct she'd sharpened over 26 years was screaming that it wasn't harmless at all. She didn't plug it into her computer to see what was on it. She didn't know why. It was only a vague gut feeling that knowing too much was sometimes more dangerous than knowing nothing. She hid the USB inside a tampon box under the bed, where no one would think to look, then tried to go on with her day as if everything were normal. But that night, when she left the Obsidian at 3 a.m. and drove home, she realized something was wrong. A black SUV was parked on the corner of her street, lights off, but she could see the shape of someone sitting inside. She went into her apartment, locked the door, and looked out the window. The SUV was still there. She couldn't sleep that night. The next day, the SUV was gone, but a different black sedan took its place. Then a pickup truck. They rotated, never the same vehicle, but always someone watching. Gemma knew she was being hunted, and the USB in the tampon box was the prey they were after. On the 3rd night, when Gemma got back to her apartment building, she caught the metallic stink of blood before she saw anything. The 3rd-floor hallway was dim, the fluorescent light flickering like in a cheap horror movie, and something was on the floor in front of Mrs. Gable's door. Mrs. Gable, the 70-year-old widow from Kansas who lived in the unit next door, who'd knocked on Gemma's door with warm apple pies on nights Gemma was starving, who'd asked no questions when Gemma cried in the hallway after Tyler left, who'd treated her like the granddaughter she'd never had, was lying on the floor in a pool of blood, her face swollen from a vicious beating. On the wall behind her, written in blood, were 4 words. "Give up the USB," Gemma screamed, a sound that tore her throat raw, then gathered Mrs. Gable into her arms, trying to find breath, trying to find a pulse. Mrs. Gable opened her eyes, clouded with pain, and whispered in a voice thin as a dying breath, "Run, child. They'll come back. They're looking for something. Run." Gemma sobbed, tears dropping onto her face, and said she'd call an ambulance. She'd be fine. But Mrs. Gable shook her head, emotion so slight it was almost invisible, and she gripped Gemma's hand with fingers gone cold. "Good girl," she whispered. "Live, child." Then she closed her eyes and didn't open them again. Gemma didn't know how long she sat there, holding Mrs. Gable's body in her arms, her tears soaking her shirt. She thought about the hot bowls of chicken noodle soup, about the stories Mrs. Gable told in her warm Midwestern drawl, about the way she called Gemma her daughter, and how Gemma had never told her that was the warmest thing she'd heard since her parents died. And she thought about the people who'd done this, the ones who'd killed an innocent old woman just because she lived next to someone holding the USB. Gemma laid Mrs. Gable down gently, closed her eyes, then stood. She didn't call the police. She knew the police wouldn't help, Or worse, they might be part of the problem. She went into her apartment, pulled the USB from its hiding place, shoved it into the pocket of her jeans, and stepped back out. Her hands were smeared with Mrs. Gable's blood, her eyes raw from crying, and inside her chest something had changed. She wasn't afraid anymore. She was angry. She drove through the night to the Obsidian, went in through the staff entrance, walked straight to the private elevator without anyone daring to stop her, because they looked into her eyes, and when the elevator doors opened on the top floor, she stepped into Jasper Drake's office at 3 a.m, her hands still blood-stained, her eyes still burning red. Jasper was sitting behind his desk, and when he lifted his head to look at her, for the first time Gemma saw something like surprise flicker across his unreadable face. She wasn't a lost bunny anymore. She was a young wolf who'd just learned the taste of blood and loss, and she was here to demand justice. Jasper didn't say a word when Gemma stepped into his office with blood on her hands and eyes burning like embers. He only lifted the phone, dialed a number, and said 2 words, "Come up here," then hung up. 2 minutes later, Bruno appeared in the doorway, and when he saw Gemma, his gray eyes darkened with something that looked like concern. Jasper pointed to the chair across from his desk and told Gemma, "Sit down and tell me everything from the beginning." Gemma sat, and she told him. She told him about the mysterious package from Tyler, about the USB and the handwritten note, about the cars tailing her for 3 days, about Mrs. Gable lying in a pool of blood with the words on the wall, about how she died in Gemma's arms with her last breath telling her to run. Her voice didn't shake. It didn't crack. It was cold and steady, like she was reading the evening news, because if she let the emotion spill out, she'd shatter and never be able to put herself back together again. When she finished, she set the USB on the desk in front of Jasper. "I don't know what's on it," she said, "but it's worth a life." Jasper picked up the USB, plugged it into his laptop, and started to read. Bruno stood behind him, and Gemma watched both their faces as they went through the contents. At first, there was focus, then surprise, and finally something far more dangerous, the calculation of men who'd just found a weapon of mass destruction. "Jesus," Bruno whispered, his voice rougher than usual. Jasper didn't speak. He only kept scrolling through, file after file, image after image, video after video. Gemma couldn't see the screen from where she sat, but she could tell from their reactions that what was on that USB wasn't a joke. Finally, Jasper looked up at her, those dark whiskey eyes sharp as a blade. "Your ex-husband," he said slowly, "stole evidence that Commissioner Walter Haynes, this city's police chief, is working with the Sinaloa cartel. This drive has a detailed list of every corrupt cop in the department, money laundering records running through small casinos, and video footage of secret meetings between Haynes and cartel bosses. Bruno, what do you think?" Bruno drew a deep breath and said, "This is a nuclear bomb. If we release it, Haynes goes down. Sinaloa loses its foothold in Vegas. But if they know we have it, they'll burn this entire city to get it back." Jasper nodded, his eyes still fixed on Gemma. "That's why they killed the old woman," he said. "They're looking for the USB, and they won't stop until they find it, or they find you." Gemma felt a chill slide down her spine, but she kept her voice calm. "So what do I do?" Jasper stood, walked around the desk, and stopped in front of her. "You'll stay here," he said, "in my penthouse, under my protection, until we finish dealing with this." Gemma rose too, instinctive resistance flaring in her. "I don't need anyone to protect me," she said, "and I don't want to owe you anything." Jasper looked at her for a moment, then turned to the laptop, typed a few keys, and rotated the screen toward her. "This is your apartment security camera," he said. "Live feed." Gemma stared at the screen and her heart clenched. Her shabby apartment was being torn apart by 3 men dressed in black. They flipped the mattress, ripped open pillows, smashed cabinets, searching for something she'd taken with her. She didn't have a home to go back to anymore. Jasper stepped closer than she'd allowed anyone to come in years, and he said in a low voice that rolled like distant thunder, "You can protect yourself from one man, but not an army. Stay here or die out there. Those are your only 2 choices." They were so close, Gemma could smell sandalwood and a faint trace of gunpowder on him, could see every line of the scar that ran from his mouth to his chin, could feel the heat coming off his body like a banked fire. Jasper lifted his hand, slowly, as if he were controlling every motion, and his fingers stopped a few centimeters from her cheek. Then he froze, not touching her, only holding his hand there in the air, as if an invisible wall stood between them. "You make me lose control," he said, his voice rougher than usual, and I hate that feeling. Gemma didn't step back. She didn't blink. She didn't breathe. She looked straight into those whiskey-dark eyes and answered, I'm not making you do anything. A moment passed, long as a century, tight as a string about to snap. Then Jasper lowered his hand, stepped back, and his face returned to its familiar cold mask, as if the moment had never happened. Bruno will take you up to the penthouse, he said, his tone calm and distant again. You'll have everything you need, and you won't leave unless I allow it. Gemma wanted to argue, wanted to say she wasn't a prisoner, but she looked at the laptop screen where her apartment was being destroyed, thought of Mrs. Gable in her blood, and she knew that right now her only choice was to agree. She gave a single nod, turned, and followed Bruno to the door. But as she stepped into the elevator, she looked back at Jasper one last time. He was standing by the window with his back to her, his silhouette cut against the Vegas night like the shadow of a lonely king on his throne. And Gemma wondered, not for the first time, whether he was protecting her or imprisoning her, and whether there was any difference between the two. Jasper Drake's penthouse took up the entire top floor of the Obsidian, a vast space with high ceilings, glass walls that looked out over all of Las Vegas, dark interiors of leather and walnut, and everything so expensive that during the first week, Gemma was afraid to touch anything. The room assigned to her was larger than the studio apartment she'd once lived in, with a king-size bed dressed in Egyptian silk sheets, a private bathroom with a marble tub, and a closet filled with new outfits she didn't ask who had bought. It was a golden cage, and Gemma knew it, but at least inside this cage, no one could kill her. On her second day in the penthouse, Orion Vance appeared at her door at 6 a.m. He didn't greet her. He didn't explain. He only said 2 words, "Come with me." Gemma followed him down to a basement level she hadn't known existed, a training room outfitted like a military base with martial arts, mats, heavy bags, and a soundproof shooting corner. "From now on," Orion said in a voice without emotion, "every day from 6 to 10 a.m, you'll be here with me. I'll teach you how to defend yourself, how to use a gun, how to survive if everything falls apart." Mr. Drake ordered it. Gemma didn't argue. She'd watched Mrs. Gable die in her arms because she couldn't protect herself, and she swore to herself that would never happen again. She trained as if her life depended on it, because it did. The first week, her body ached so badly she couldn't lift her arms to brush her hair. The second week, her reflexes started to sharpen. Her strikes began to carry force. The third week, Orion handed her a Glock 17 and taught her how to shoot. She absorbed everything so quickly that even Orion, a man who never seemed impressed by anything, had to lift his head when she hit the target 10 shots in a row on her 5th session. "You've got talent," Orion said, his voice still flat but his eyes holding something like acceptance. "Most people take months to reach this level of accuracy." Gemma didn't answer. She only reloaded and kept firing, and every bullet that tore through the target was a piece of fear leaving her body. Sometimes, while she trained, she could feel another presence in the room. She didn't need to turn around to know Jasper was standing in the doorway, watching her. She could feel his gaze on her back like a warm track, following every movement, every punch, every shot. He didn't speak. He didn't comment. He only stood there for a while and then disappeared. But each time it happened, Gemma trained a little harder, as if she were trying to prove something to him or to herself. Dinner was the strangest part. Jasper required her to eat with him every night in the penthouse dining room, a room with a long oak table that could seat 20 people but held only 2 chairs placed across from each other. The first dinners passed in heavy silence, only the faint clink of silverware and the distant echo of the city. Gemma didn't know what to say, and Jasper didn't seem to care about talking. Then one night Jasper suddenly asked what kind of books she liked, and Gemma was so surprised she almost dropped her fork. She answered, and from there conversations began to sprout from barren ground. At first the topics were safe: books, movies, music. But gradually, like layers of paint peeling away, they began to tell truer things. Jasper spoke about his father, a previous generation mafia boss who'd been betrayed and killed when Jasper was 19. He spoke about the bloody years afterward, about having to fight for power from the people who'd killed his father, about sleepless nights and choices that cost him piece after piece of his soul. He spoke about the loneliness at the top, about not being able to trust anyone, about how everyone who came close to him wanted something. Gemma listened, and in return she spoke about foster care, about families who'd taken her in for the stipend, and treated her like trash. About nights she went to bed hungry because no one fed her. About Tyler, and how he'd tricked her into believing in love and then betrayed her. They didn't comfort each other. They didn't say empty things like, "I understand," or "everything will be fine." They only listened, and somehow that meant more than any consolation ever could. One night, around 2 a.m, Gemma woke up to the sound of her own screaming filling the room. The nightmare still clung to her. The image of Mrs. Gable in a pool of blood, the words on the wall, the clouded eyes closing for the last time. She jolted upright, drenched in sweat, her heart hammering like it might burst. And that was when she realized Jasper was standing in her doorway. He didn't ask if she was all right. He didn't offer meaningless words. He only walked in, dragged the chair by the window closer to her bed, and sat down. In the dark, she could only make out the outline of his face, the scar on his chin, and those whiskey-dark eyes catching the city light slipping through the glass. He didn't say a single word. He only sat there, a silent, steady presence like a wall, as if he was saying she wasn't alone, that someone was here, that he wasn't going anywhere. Gemma didn't know when she fell back asleep, but when she woke the next morning, the chair was empty, and Jasper was gone, as if the night before had been only a dream. They didn't mention it at breakfast, didn't mention it in the days that followed, but something had shifted between them. An invisible thread had been tied, and Gemma knew that no matter how hard she tried, she couldn't deny that this man, this cold, ruthless mafia boss, was taking up a place in her heart she hadn't allowed anyone to touch since Tyler left. The war didn't begin with gunfire. It began with the wail of police sirens. One morning, Commissioner Walter Haynes struck first, raiding one of Jasper's legitimate businesses, a high-end restaurant downtown, on allegations of tax evasion and money laundering. They arrested 5 of Jasper's men, seized the records, and left a message that didn't need to be spoken out loud. Hand over the USB or this is only the beginning. Gemma watched the news on the living room television in the penthouse, staring at Haynes's smug face as he spoke into the cameras about cleansing the city of organized crime, and nausea rose in her throat. She knew that face. She'd seen it in the videos on the USB, sitting there laughing with cartel bosses while they discussed how to split the profits. Jasper hit back that very night. Through underground sources and corruption exposing bloggers, he leaked a small portion of the evidence, just enough to spark questions, suspicion, the first hairline cracks in Haynes's polished public image. The press started digging. Hard questions were thrown at press conferences. Gemma could see fury burning in Haynes's eyes each time he appeared on television. But the Sinaloa cartel didn't play politics. 2 days after the leak, a Mexican man showed up at the Obsidian and demanded to see Jasper. Gemma wasn't allowed in that meeting, but she could guess the content from Bruno's face when he came out. Paler and tighter than she'd ever seen. They threatened an all-out strike, Bruno told her afterward, his voice rough. If we don't hand over the USB in 7 days, they'll burn everything down. Jasper refused, Gemma said. It wasn't a question. Bruno nodded. He told them if they want war, he'll give them war. The days that followed moved under tension, drawn tight as wire. More men were assigned to the Obsidian. Weapons were checked and distributed. Evacuation plans were drafted. Gemma kept training with Orion, but now every drill carried a new weight, an urgency she could feel in every punch, every shot. Then one afternoon her phone buzzed with a call from the rehab center. Noah will be discharged in 2 weeks, the head nurse said brightly. He's completed the program and he's ready to return to normal life. Gemma ended the call and stood there in the training room with the gun still in her hand. And for the first time since all of this began, she felt real fear. Not fear for herself, but fear for Noah. If Haynes or the cartel found her brother, they'd use him to threaten her, to force her to hand over the USB. And she knew she wouldn't be able to refuse. She meant to tell Jasper. She meant to ask for his help, but she didn't know how to say it without sounding like she was begging. That evening Bruno knocked on her door. He stood in the doorway, stern, but with something softer in his eyes, and said she should know Mr. Drake had sent 4 men to her brother's rehab center. They'd protect him 24/7 until this was over. That was the order he gave this morning. Gemma couldn't speak for a moment. She only stood there looking at Bruno, trying to process it. Jasper had known her fear before she'd said a word, had acted before she'd had to ask, had protected the person she loved without making her owe him anything. "Thank you," she said to Bruno, her voice unsteady. But the truth was, she wanted to say it to Jasper. Late that night, When she couldn't sleep and wandered into the living room, she found Jasper standing alone on the balcony, a glass of whiskey in his hand, staring out at the glittering city below. She slid the glass door open and stepped outside, the cool desert night wrapping around her. Jasper didn't turn, but she knew he knew she was there. She walked up beside him, leaned against the railing, and they stood in silence for a long time. "You should leave," Jasper said at last, his voice low and more tired than she'd ever heard it. "When it blows up, it'll be bad. I can't promise I'll protect you." Gemma looked at him, at the scar on his chin, at those whiskey-dark eyes now heavy as a sky before a storm, and she said she didn't need promises. She'd been running her whole life, from foster care, from Tyler, from herself. She didn't want to run anymore. She needed a place to stand and fight, and this place, beside him, was the place she chose. Jasper turned to look at her, and in the dim city light, she saw something in his eyes she'd never seen before. Something soft and vulnerable behind the ice. "You're not like anyone I've ever met," he said. Gemma gave a small smile. "You're not either, and I'm not sure that's a good thing or a bad thing." And then Jasper Drake did something she didn't expect. He laughed, a real laugh, not cold, not mocking, but the laugh of a man who'd forgotten how to laugh and had just remembered. He set his whiskey on the railing, turned to face her fully, and lifted his hand. His fingers touched her cheek, gentle as if he was afraid she'd disappear, and she could feel them trembling slightly. Jasper Drake, the king of Las Vegas's underworld, the man the whole city feared, was trembling when he touched her. Gemma didn't step back. She didn't blink. She didn't breathe. She only stood there and let him touch her as if she were something precious, something worth holding with care. Then he bent down and kissed her. The kiss was slow, tender, restrained, as if he feared she'd break if he pressed any harder. Gemma closed her eyes and kissed him back. And in that moment, on the balcony of the Black Tower overlooking the city of sin, she forgot Haynes. She forgot the cartel. She forgot the USB and the war about to come. She only knew his mouth on hers, and the feeling that for the first time in her life, she was exactly where she belonged. 3 nights after the kiss on the balcony, hell opened its doors. Gemma was asleep when the first explosion hit, shaking the entire building like an earthquake. She jolted upright, her heart slamming, and at that exact moment, the lights died, darkness swallowing the room. Seconds later, the gunfire began, not 1 or 2 shots, but a relentless barrage, echoing up from the lower floors like metallic hail. Her door burst open, and Orion appeared in the strobing glow of the emergency lights, a rifle in his hands, his face carved from ice. "Come with me," he said, short, no explanation. Gemma didn't need one. She'd known this was coming. She just hadn't expected it to come this fast. She threw on clothes and ran after Orion down the hallway, the gunfire growing closer, louder with every step. "They're coming up from the basement," Orion said over his shoulder. "Sinaloa and Haynes's mercenaries, at least 30. They've breached the security system." They pounded down the stairs, and on the level below, Gemma saw the war zone. The obsidian had become a combat zone. Shattered glass, flying rounds, bodies scattered across the floor. She saw Jasper in the middle of the chaos, a gun in his hand, his face cold as steel as he dropped enemies with the precision of a professional killer. Bruno was beside him. Phoenix was tucked behind a concrete pillar returning fire, and the others, Jasper's men, were fighting to hold every inch. Orion shoved Gemma into a small room at the end of the hall. "Here," he said. "This is the safe room. You stay here until it's over." Gemma looked inside. Steel-lined walls, no windows, a table and a few bottles of water. A luxurious coffin. "No," she said, and even she was surprised by how steady her voice was. "I'm not hiding." Orion looked at her, and for a brief moment she saw something like respect flash across his cold eyes. He didn't argue. He only drew a Glock from his waistband and handed it to her. "Aim for center mass," he said. "Don't try to be a hero, and don't die." Then he vanished into the hallway darkness, and Gemma stood there with the gun in her hand, her heart pounding like a war drum, but she wasn't afraid. She ran toward the gunfire. She didn't run away. The weeks of training with Orion had changed her, not just her body but her mind. She wasn't a victim anymore. She was a fighter. She found cover behind the bar in the VIP basement, the place where she'd once stood pouring drinks like it belonged to another lifetime. From there she could see the battlefield, and she saw Bruno. He was firing toward the elevator doors. not knowing a mercenary was slipping up behind him, gun raised, finger on the trigger. Gemma didn't think. She lifted the Glock, aimed the way Orion had taught, drew a breath, and squeezed. The shot tore through the mercenary's shoulder. He went down screaming, his gun clattering away across the floor. Bruno spun, saw the attacker on the ground, then looked toward Gemma with eyes wide in shock. "You've got guts, kid," he shouted over the gunfire, half stunned, half impressed. But they were losing. Even with Jasper and his men fighting like demons, the enemy had numbers, and the ammunition was running low. Jasper saw it, and shouted the retreat order through the storm of gunfire. Gemma ran with the group through a hidden door behind the bar she'd never known existed. They plunged into a pitch-black tunnel, damp air, and the stink of old concrete, their footsteps pounding like drums of war. The tunnel led to an underground parking bay, where a black armored SUV was waiting. Jasper drove, Bruno rode shotgun, Orion, Phoenix, and Gemma piled into the back, and they shot out of the building like a bullet into the night. Gemma looked back through the rear window and saw the obsidian burning, orange flames licking up into the Las Vegas sky like a funeral pyre for Jasper Drake's empire. They drove through the night, across the Mojave Desert, down nameless roads Gemma hadn't known existed. 2 hours later, they reached a safe house, a concrete fortress in the middle of nowhere, thick walls, a steel door, and nothing around it but sand and scrub. Inside, they counted the damage. Jasper had a wound on his arm, a graze where a bullet had clipped him, but he didn't seem to notice. Bruno had bruises. Phoenix's shirt was torn. Orion was untouched, as if bullets were afraid of him. And Gemma, she was still standing, her hand still wrapped around the Glock, her heart still beating, alive. But they knew it wasn't over. Less than an hour after they arrived, headlights appeared on the desert horizon. Haynes and the cartel had tracked them. They were surrounded, low on ammo, no reinforcements, but they still had the USB, and they still had each other. Jasper stared through the small window, his whiskey dark eyes burning with something that wasn't fear but the resolve of a man with nothing left to lose. He turned to Gemma, and in that moment, in the darkness and danger, he didn't speak, but his gaze said everything. No matter what happened, he wouldn't let her die, even if it meant he'd die in her place. The gunfire stopped abruptly, as if someone had flipped a switch, and the silence that followed was more terrifying than the sound of bullets. Gemma knew this wasn't good. Silence in war meant the enemy was setting something up, and she didn't have to wait long to find out what. A loudspeaker crackled to life outside, echoing across the desert night. The voice of a man confident and powerful. "Jasper Drake, this is Commissioner Haynes. I know you're in there. I've got a simple offer. Hand over the USB and the girl, and everyone else can walk away in peace. No one needs to die anymore tonight." Jasper stood by the window with his back against the concrete wall, a gun in his hand, and he answered with a shout that cut through the thick walls. "Go to hell, Haynes." A pause. Then Haynes laughed through the speaker, cold and smug. "I figured you'd say that," Haynes said. "So I brought something to persuade you. Someone who really wants to see his wife again." Gemma felt the blood in her body turn to ice before she even understood why. And then the next voice rang out. A voice she'd tried to forget for 6 months. A voice that had once whispered love and lies. "Gemma!" Tyler shouted, his voice shaking and frantic. "Gemma, please come out. They said if you come out, they'll let me go. I don't want to die. Please, baby, please." Gemma rushed to the small window and looked outside. Under the harsh headlights of the SUVs encircling the house, Tyler Briggs was on his knees in the dirt, face bruised, hands bound behind his back, clothes torn and stained with blood. He looked more pathetic than she remembered, smaller, weaker, and she wondered how she'd ever loved a man like him. Haynes stood behind Tyler with a gun pressed to the back of his head, a smile on his face, the smile of someone who knew he was holding a trump card. Gemma shouted through the window, her voice carrying into the night. "Tyler, why do they know I'm here? How did they find me?" Tyler lifted his head, eyes red from crying, and answered in a broken voice. "They caught me at the Mexico border. I was trying to run, but I'd been tracking your social media and bank activity to see if the cartel found the USB. They caught me at the border and tortured me until I told them exactly where you were working. I told them I sent the USB to you. I sold you to live, Gemma. I'm sorry. I'm sorry." Gemma stood there, staring at the man who'd once promised to love her for life, kneeling in the sand, and the truth crashed down on her like a hammer. Tyler hadn't sent the USB to her because he was sorry, not because he wanted her safe. He'd sent it to use her as bait. He knew the cartel would track the package. He knew they'd come for her. And he'd hoped that while they chased her, he could slip away. He'd traded her life to buy himself more time. Mrs. Gable died because of him. Gemma had been forced to run because of him. Everything she'd lost, all the blood that had been spilled, was because of a coward who didn't have the courage to face the consequences of his own actions. Gemma felt something in her chest break apart, but it wasn't her heart. It was the last remnants of the old girl, the girl who'd loved Tyler Briggs, who'd believed his promises, who'd dreamed of a normal life with him. That girl died right here, in this moment, and what rose from the ashes was someone else entirely. Gemma turned and looked at Jasper. He was watching her, those whiskey, dark eyes, not judging, not weighing her, only waiting. He'd do anything, she decided. She knew it. He'd hand her over to Haynes if she asked. He'd fight to the death if she wanted. He'd burn this entire desert if she needed it. Jasper Drake had never promised her anything. He hadn't promised to love her at an altar, hadn't vowed to protect her before God. But he was here, in a concrete house in the middle of the desert, surrounded by enemies, ready to die to keep her safe. Tyler had promised everything and kept nothing. Jasper had promised nothing and was putting everything on the table. Gemma held Jasper's gaze, and her voice was so calm it surprised even her. "Orion," she said, without looking toward the massive man in the corner holding a sniper rifle. "From this position, can you hit Haynes?" Orion looked out the window, judged the distance and the angle, and gave a single nod. "I can," he said, "but he's using your husband as a shield. If I miss, I'll hit Tyler." Gemma looked back out the window at Tyler kneeling under the headlights, tears running down his battered face, his mouth still shouting and begging her to save him. She remembered their wedding, the white dress bought on sale, the small church in the suburbs, and the vows he'd spoken. "I promise to love you. I promise to protect you, in sickness and in health, till death do us part." Death hadn't parted them. His cowardice had. Gemma turned back to Jasper and said, her voice steady, "I'll make him move out of cover." Gemma explained the plan in a voice as calm as if she were talking about the weather instead of placing her life in the hands of fate. She would step outside, hold up the USB as bait, and when Haynes got distracted and moved out of his position behind Tyler, Orion would take the shot. Jasper listened, and when she finished, he said a single word. "No." Gemma looked at him, not surprised. "Too dangerous," Jasper said, his voice drawn tight like steel wire. "You'll be standing in front of 20 guns. All it takes is one idiot panicking and pulling the trigger, and you're dead." Gemma answered, her tone still even. "Then do you have a better option? How many bullets do we have left?" "Enough for another firefight. The FBI backup you contacted won't arrive for 2 more hours. We don't have 2 hours. Haynes will blow this house apart before dawn." Jasper fell silent, jaw clenched, and Gemma knew he didn't have an answer, because there wasn't one. Bruno spoke from the corner, his voice rough and exhausted. "She's right. This is the only way. If Orion drops Haynes, the mercenaries lose their head. Nobody gets paid for a dead man." Orion nodded once. "I won't miss." Jasper looked at each of them. Then his gaze settled on Gemma. He stepped closer, close enough that she could see every line of the scar running from his mouth to his chin, and he took her hand. His hand was warm and rough, his fingers tightening as if he was afraid she'd vanish. "If you die," Jasper said, his voice low and trembling in a way she'd never heard before, "I'll burn this city down. I'll kill them one by one. I'll turn Nevada into hell on earth." Gemma smiled and lifted her hand to touch his cheek. "Then you'd better make sure I don't die," she said. Then she turned and walked toward the front door before he could stop her. She opened it and stepped outside into the blinding headlights, into the muzzles of 20 mercenary rifles, into the greedy stare on Haynes's face when he saw her appear. In her hand, raised high above her head, was a small silver object flashing under the lights. "Cease fire," Haynes shouted, and the gunfire died. Everyone stared at her like she was a god holding their fate in her hands. Tyler let out a breath, a thin sigh of relief, and Gemma could see him smiling, believing she'd come to save him, believing she still loved him, believing everything would be fine. "Give it to me," Haynes said, his voice smug as if he'd already won. "Come closer and hand it to me, and then we can all go home." Gemma walked forward, step by slow step, and stopped 10 meters away. She looked at Tyler, at the bruised face smiling at her, and she spoke in a voice that carried through the desert night. "Tyler," she said, "you promised to love and protect me before God. You swore you'd stand by me in riches and in poverty, in sickness and in health. But you sold me. You used me as bait to save your coward life. You let them kill an innocent old woman because of you. Now I don't owe you anything." Tyler's smile collapsed, replaced by panic as he realized what was coming. "Gemma," he stammered, "what are you doing?" Gemma didn't answer. She hurled the object in her hand toward the far desert brush, throwing with all her strength, and under the headlights it flashed like a shooting star. "The USB!" Haynes shouted, instinct overwhelming reason, and he shoved Tyler aside and lunged toward the glittering object arcing through the air. Gemma dropped flat immediately, face pressed into the sand, and in the same instant a shot cracked from the safe house. A single round, precise as lightning, punched through Commissioner Walter Haynes's head before he'd taken 3 steps. He went down like a puppet with its strings cut, dead before he hit the ground. Chaos erupted. The mercenaries lost their leader, lost their paymaster, lost their reason to fight. Some ran for their vehicles. Some froze, not knowing what to do. And in that moment the safe house door slammed open and Jasper led the counterattack. Gunfire erupted, shouting, engines roaring as the survivors fled into the black night. The battle ended faster than it began. When silence returned, Gemma rose, brushed sand from her clothes, and saw Tyler on his knees, shaking and sobbing. He looked up at her with pleading eyes. "Gemma," he said, his voice broken, "please save me. We can start over. I'll change. I promise." Gemma looked down at him and felt nothing. No anger, no pity, nothing left at all. Only the emptiness where love had once lived. "There's no us, Tyler," she said, her voice cold as the desert at midnight. She turned to Jasper beside her, his gun still in hand. "Get him out of Nevada. If he comes back, bury him in the desert." Jasper nodded to Orion, and the huge man stepped forward, grabbed Tyler by the collar, and dragged him away like a bag of trash. Tyler's pleading grew fainter, then vanished into the dark. Jasper glanced toward the brush where Gemma had thrown the flashing object. "What about the USB?" Gemma smiled and reached into the back pocket of her jeans, pulling out the real USB. "I threw my Zippo lighter," she said. "Picked up a few tricks working as a bartender." Jasper looked at her, and on his face, for the first time, Gemma saw something that looked like real admiration. Then he smiled, a quiet laugh deep in his chest, and he stepped forward and pulled her into his arms. He kissed her in the Mojave Desert, among the dead and the wind moving through the brush, while dawn bled red across the eastern horizon. And Gemma kissed him back, because for the first time in her life, she knew she was exactly where she belonged. 3 months after the blood-soaked night in the Mojave Desert, the Obsidian opened its doors again. The black glass tower rose from the Las Vegas Strip, like a phoenix reborn from ash, bigger, more magnificent, and more dangerous than ever. The new neon sign burned through the night, no longer a warning but a declaration of power to the entire city. The USB had been delivered to the federal FBI through Jasper's lawyer, an unspoken deal signed in exchange for immunity from prosecution and a promise that the Obsidian would be allowed to operate without interference. Commissioner Walter Haynes was exposed as corrupt even after death, his image in the press shifting from crime-fighting hero to the biggest criminal in the history of the Las Vegas Police Department. The network of dirty cops he built collapsed like a sandcastle. Dozens arrested, hundreds investigated, and the whole system forced to restructure from the ground up. The Sinaloa cartel, stripped of its protection inside the government, decided to withdraw from Vegas for the time being to avoid the FBI's attention. They'd come back. Gemma knew that. But that was tomorrow's problem, not today's. Gemma Lane didn't stand behind the bar anymore. She didn't pour drinks for bosses. She didn't bow her head and stay silent. She wasn't the girl with $62 in her pocket and wolves at her heels. Now she sat beside Jasper Drake in every meeting, every important decision of the Empire. She wasn't his wife, not his lover in the ordinary sense. She was something beyond that, a partner, an advisor, the only person who could look him in the eye and say no without fearing consequences. She didn't wear old thrift store clothes anymore. Her closet now held perfectly tailored suits, expensive heels, and jewelry whose price could have kept her alive for a year back then. But even as her appearance changed, she was still herself, sharp, direct, unwilling to bow to anyone. When she stepped into the conference room, the most dangerous men in Las Vegas fell silent. When she gave an order, they obeyed without argument. They called her the Queen of the Night behind her back, and she knew it. But she didn't care about titles. She only cared about never having to kneel to anyone again. Noah had left rehab 2 months earlier, healthy, clean, and full of hope, in a way Gemma hadn't seen in her brother since they were kids. He was working in the Obsidian's accounting department now, a safe job with good pay and 24/7 protection he didn't even know he had. Gemma met him once a week for dinner, watched him smile and talk about his new life, and for the first time in years, she didn't have to worry he'd die in some dark alley with a needle still stuck in his arm. Tonight, with the city below blazing in neon like a paradise of sin and dreams, Gemma stood on the penthouse balcony and looked down. Las Vegas spread beneath her like a carpet of light, and she remembered the first night she'd come here, driving her battered Honda Civic through the desert, not knowing her life was about to change forever. Footsteps behind her, then Jasper's warmth as he came to stand at her back, his arms wrapping around her waist. They stood like that for a long time, saying nothing, only watching the city they ruled together. "Do you regret anything?" Jasper asked, his voice low and warm against her ear. Gemma thought about the question. She thought about the shabby downtown studio, about starving nights when she couldn't afford food, about Tyler and his hollow promises, about Mrs. Gable and the steaming bowls of chicken soup on cold days, about blood on her hands and screams in the night. She'd lost a lot to get here. She'd traded away innocence, trust in people, and a piece of her soul she wasn't sure she'd ever get back. But she'd found a lot, too. She'd found strength she didn't know she had. She'd found family among outlaws. She'd found love in the last place she'd expected. "No," she answered, calm and certain. "I lost a life, but I found a life worth living." Jasper kissed her hair, the familiar scent of sandalwood and gunpowder wrapping around her like a warm blanket. "You know," he said, "you walked into my bar looking for a job, but you walked out with my heart. I didn't plan on letting you take it, but you took it anyway." Gemma turned in his arms and looked up into those whiskey-dark eyes that 3 months ago had been ice-cold and now warmed every time they looked at her. "So, what are you going to do about it?" she asked. Jasper lifted a hand to stroke her hair, his fingers threading through the black silk strands. "Keep you forever," he said, "if you'll allow it." Gemma smiled, the smile of a woman who'd been through hell and survived, a woman who wasn't afraid of anything anymore. "I'm not allowing it," she replied. "But I'm not going anywhere either." Jasper laughed, then bent to kiss her, and Gemma closed her eyes and let herself sink into the kiss. When they pulled apart, she looked out and saw a black car parked on the corner below, watching the building. Sinaloa, maybe, or a new enemy, or just someone curious. She didn't know, and she wasn't afraid, because she wasn't alone anymore. She had Jasper, she had Bruno, she had Orion and Phoenix, she had Noah. She had a family made of blood and fire she'd found in the dark, and if anyone wanted to come here and test them, Gemma Lane would be ready. She'd gone from a girl with $62 in her pocket to the queen of Las Vegas's underworld, and she wouldn't let anyone take what she'd fought to claim. And that is the story of Gemma Lane, the girl who walked into a mafia bar with $62 in her pocket looking for a paycheck, and walked out with a family and a spine made of steel. Tyler Briggs promised to love and protect her at the church altar, swearing before God that he'd stand by her in every circumstance. But when danger came, he sold her to save himself without a second thought. Jasper Drake promised nothing that night in the dark bar. Not a vow, not a commitment, but he put his own life on the line to protect her, ready to burn the entire city if she was harmed. It makes us ask where real promises live, in beautiful words or in actions when no one is watching. This story teaches us that sometimes family isn't the people who share your blood, but the people who are willing to stand beside you when the whole world turns its back. It reminds us that real strength doesn't come from never falling, but from getting back up every time you're knocked down. And most of all, it shows us that a painful past doesn't define us. We choose how we keep writing our story. So what about you? How did this story make you feel? Have you ever met people who promised the world but did almost nothing? Or have you been lucky enough to have someone like Jasper beside you, not saying much, but always there when you needed them? Share with us in the comments below. We'd really love to hear what you're feeling deep in your heart. If you enjoyed this story of betrayal, courage, and dark love, hit like hard, Share this video with friends who love mafia romance. And don't forget to subscribe and turn on notifications so you won't miss new stories every day. We sincerely thank you for taking the time to watch this video. We wish you and your family good health, a joyful life, and peaceful days ahead. Goodbye, and we'll see you in the next video.